500 feet per second.
Pretty close.
By the time it goes out the stack, it's less than 200 degrees. So we pulled in excess of 800 degrees of temperature out of that air, put it into the water, converted it to steam.
I don't know if everybody heard, but apparently a third of their electricity is generated from that heated
Steam.
So that's,
That turns the steam turbine. That's right.
That's what gives us the efficiency of the plant and that lower heat rate.
Uh-huh.
You can just
That I just don't have.
Is this the newest combined cycle plant in New England?
Well, as I'd mentioned, there's about $6 million worth
Right.
of investment that all are about the same vintage. This happens to be the most efficient combustion turbine that's in commercial availability now.
Is it the largest one in New England?
It is the largest gas
Gas one?
turbine.
Yeah.
It's not the largest power plant.
Right, but the gas.
Yeah, that particular gas turbine is the largest gas turbine.
Clean energy?
Clean energy.
Down in Connecticut?
Yeah.
Yeah, their engines are a little smaller than ours,
Okay.
so therefore their output is a little smaller than ours. Yeah, they're down in Boston, Massachusetts. There's a power plant that has 4 of these gas turbines. They're just like ours.
Everett.
Yes.
Are they single cycle?
No, they're
No,
combined cycle.
they're combined cycle.
But they're air cooled,
Uh-huh.
so they're less efficient than we are.
So what I had asked Howard, if it's okay with you guys. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Hi. Hey, Chris Beck is Commissioner of Public Service there.
Hi, folks. Sorry I missed the tour, but glad to be here anyway.
Is to finish up the presentation that you were doing, because it might sort of cue some questions that you have with regard to siting, so he'll finish it up and then we'll just have a discussion.
You may want to just go back to the beginning and start.
Well, we can, oops.
I put you back at the beginning.
Yeah, this was the beginning of the section on the Site Evaluation Committee, and as we were saying, it's established by statute. It's composed of the department heads and senior administrators of about 8 state agencies that are deemed to have an interest in one aspect or another of power plant siting. And it deals with any power plant that's 30 megawatts or greater. The idea is to give it one-stop shopping so that the developer can come to one place and have a coordinated review of all of the various permits that he would otherwise have to shop around to the various state agencies separately.
And where do the appeals go? Where do appeals of any certificates go? Do they go to your...
They go to the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. And in fact, the certificate of site and facility for this plant went to the state Supreme Court because there was a neighborhood group that was concerned about neighborhood impacts, ranging from noise to pollution to whatever. And they weren't happy with the fact that the Site Evaluation Committee went ahead and permitted the plant, found that the proposals for dealing with all of those issues were reasonable. The Supreme Court ultimately agreed that the Site Evaluation Committee had acted reasonably, and it upheld the certificate of site and facility. But this plant actually did go up to the Supreme Court.
Was that the neighborhood that way?
The Londonderry Neighborhood Coalition. Yeah.
Was this already, I'm sorry, you may have already covered some of the questions I have, but was this already an industrial park, established industrial park?
Yeah. This plant is situated, Jim or Bill can probably tell you better than I can, but this plant was situated in the eco-industrial park that Londonderry planned as an industrial park, adjacent to the airport for convenience. Actually, for those of you who are interested, AES collaborated with the Conservation Law Foundation in designing the plant because it was originally intended to have combined heat and power benefits to the whole eco-industrial park. That didn't develop.
Were they part of a stakeholder process that included the neighborhood group?
I don't
Was it
think
just
that the
within
neighborhood
the-
group was included in a stakeholder process that way.
Okay.
I think it was CLF and
It's CLF Ventures,
AES.
not CLF.
Pardon?
CLF Ventures. It's the for-profit
Yes,
arm
yes.
of CLF.
Yeah, it's the affiliate.
So that was just to work with the distributed heat.
Right.
And that did not happen. you
It
said?
didn't happen. And I can't tell you why. There were a whole lot of technical reasons. It just didn't develop, didn't take off the way they had hoped it would. Anyway, back to the SEC.
With that many people, de facto, we had a little chat about this earlier,
Yeah.
that was trying to get all 15 people together. Is that too many people? That's probably a bad way to put that question.
Well, I'm the
but a
wrong
lot
one to ask. You should ask the SEC that
Okay,
question.
all right.
But I think they would tell you that scheduling is a problem, because these are all people that run state
Agencies,
agencies.
yeah.
They have day jobs,
That's
and they're
what
not
the lawyer said.
insignificant day jobs.
He said scheduling was his biggest problem.
Can they assign surrogates?
Obviously
They
not.
can.
They can?
The statute is written in such a way that it would be the commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services or his designee. But if it is a designee, it's usually an assistant commissioner. It's meant to be a senior administrator. And the reason is simply so that they can bring the pressure of the top bureaucrats to bear to make sure that the permits are being processed properly and timely, so that they all get to the same place at the same time at the end of the process.
They're all appointed by the governor, right?
They're all appointed by the governor.
Well, the way it works in New Hampshire, I know for the Department of Environmental Protection at least, is it's a rotating a committee appoints the person, and they usually stay through terms.
Yeah, they don't change automatically with each new, government. It's really
So there's a little bit of an insulation
delay,
there.
yeah.
So the Site Evaluation Committee issues the certificates of site and facility for facilities of more than 30 megawatts. It sets the terms and conditions, and those come up through the agencies, the separate agencies, but they're all approved by the full committee as part of the certificate of site and facility. And in Granite Ridge's case, it was over 300 of those terms and conditions, covering everything from noise to, hours of traffic on the road during construction, to air emissions, you name it, over 300 of them. The SEC follows the construction and operation of the facility by monitoring it through construction, and it enforces terms and conditions if that becomes necessary. The next page.
I'm sorry, but a question had been asked earlier. They monitor through construction, but any of the separate environmental permits are monitored by the environmental agencies or by the SEC staff?
No, they would all be enforced through the agencies that issued them, but the committee takes responsibility and approves all of the monitoring, all of the enforcement activities that have to go on. This, I think, is a critical piece, because the statute requires that in order to issue a certificate of site and facility, the committee has to find three broad things. First, that the applicant has adequate financial, technical, and managerial capability to assure construction and operation in compliance with the terms of the certificate. Secondly, and this goes to the heart of the permitting process, that the site and facility will not unduly interfere with the orderly development of the region, with due consideration to the views of municipal and regional planning commissions and municipal governing bodies. Towns and regional planning commissions are authorized under the statute to intervene and come before the committee and say, we would like you to attach these conditions to the operation of this plant. The committee isn't bound to do that, but the towns have a forum in which to express their local concerns in lieu of having the applicant go before the zoning board or the planning board in the town. Okay?
Can I ask you, though, the process before the SEC, is it a contested case process?
Yes. These-
Is it like Vermont that has everything pre-filed and?
Yes.
So how do
If-
the towns participate? Do they?
They have to wait until the applicant files, but then they're entitled to get all of the filing.
Yeah, but I understand that, but who pays for their participation? They do?
They do.
No intervenor funding in Vermont? Excuse me.
No,
yes.
the Department of Justice has a lawyer from the Attorney General's office
Uh-huh.
who represents the public. And it's his or her job to try to help members of the public who have concerns or questions to focus their questions. He will cross-examine the applicant's witnesses on their behalf. But if the towns want to intervene, I mean, they could do it pro se, but usually they would hire an attorney, and that would be at their cost.
You
But
say
they
they have
can-
the ability to influence some of the conditions. Do they have an ability to simply say no?
The towns?
Yes.
No.
No, okay.
All they can do is say, we think this is an important issue for the town of, Lincoln or whatever it is. And we hope that you will include this as one of the terms and conditions.
Okay.
And generally, the commissioners are going to, the committee members are going to do that unless they feel it's unreasonable, because they have an interest in making sure that the project doesn't interfere with the orderly development of the region.
Yep. Okay.
So then the third set of findings they have to make is that the project will not have an unreasonable adverse impact on aesthetics, historic sites, air and water quality, the natural environment, or public health and safety. And we could go on and talk for a long time about the site evaluation committee, but I think we should turn it back to you now, Linda, because I think the commissioners have their own discussion that they want to go into, right?
Sure,
do
it's
you
all
wanna-
based on questions related to all these different things, so.
Don't go away, Bill.
Have at it.
I had started to ask earlier, I mean, who pays for this process in New Hampshire? Does the applicant pay a fee for review?
The applicant pays the out-of-pocket costs that the committee has to incur for hiring its own counsel, a stenographer, to record the proceedings, all that sort of thing. But when the Commissioner of Environmental Services takes 11 days out of his work year to sit on siting a 30-megawatt wind project, he gets his paycheck from the Department of Environmental
I
Services.
understand that, but so there's no support going to the department to pay for that? The taxpayers of, geez, you don't have, I mean, how's
No
how's the
filing
process
fee,
funding?
no.
Filing fees?
There's a pro forma filing fee. I'll have to check to see what it is, but it's modest.
So are you paying the underlying filing fees for all the permits that are consolidated?
Yeah.
That's how they're paying for it
Yeah.
then? Because they're still paying the filing fee for every
I'm
single
sorry.
permit. That's what I'm trying to get
I
at.
slid over
How's
that, but yes, that's-
how's the staff done? And then the costs that the SEC has are all paid bill back.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense for this size project, how much the SEC process cost the company?
Well, I had a conversation with Linda on the phone a couple of days ago, and just to give you a sense of how it's changing,
Yeah.
I think when AES was before the SEC in 1998, 1999, for the certificate of site and facility for this plant, which is a 750 megawatt plant, there were 3 days of hearings on the merits in which the applicant put in testimony, was cross-examined by the public advocate and any towns, including the town of Londonderry that wanted to intervene, was cross-examined by the committee members. 3 days. 2 of my partners just finished an 11-day contested hearing for a 30-megawatt wind project in southwestern New Hampshire. That's how much it's changed in 15 years.
You said that there's a public advocate, and that's from the AG's office. I just want to be clear, was a public advocate from the AG's office?
Yes.
And representing the state as a whole, or the neighbors, or both?
His or her job is to represent the members of the public who intervene, but don't hire their own counsel.
Okay.
Members of the public are free to hire their own counsel, and sometimes do. The Londonderry Neighborhood Coalition had its own lawyer when this plant was built.
So in Vermont we have a Department of Public Service, or Public Service Department, and there is an Office of Public Advocate there, but they represent ratepayers. So and they don't represent the interests of the general public, so is there an equivalent to that in New Hampshire?
Yeah, in New Hampshire, it would be the Department of Public Utilities, the Public Utilities Commission that deals with rates. Okay, the siting process doesn't deal with rates per se. It deals with environmental issues, and primarily environmental, but cultural, historic, all those kinds of things. This project is not subject to rate regulation because New Hampshire was deregulated, at least all except for PSNH. So Granite Ridge does not go before the public
So in
utilities.
the wind case that you're talking about, does that involve rates?
No, because that is also what's called a merchant generator. The generation sector in New Hampshire, unlike Vermont, was deregulated, which means that generators take their own risks in the market, as Jim was saying earlier. It's the investors, the stockholders in the companies that build these plants.
So they have to get a separate power purchase.
Yeah, they take the risk, and they charge what the market will bear, but they can't look to ratepayers to be bailed out if they get in over their heads.
So that wind case, I just saw something, I think from the public advocate in New Hampshire, that said the project was no good or something. And so that was not reflecting the opinions of the state of New Hampshire,
No.
as it would if our public advocate did it. That was reflecting the neighbors or the towns or whoever. I don't know who was on behalf of.
Yeah. If he was speaking for constituents, it would have been those members of the public that wanted to intervene in the case but weren't going to be able to hire their own counsel for one reason or another.
Can we talk, I want to talk a little bit more about, why did, do you know why was this plant put here?
I think there are a couple of good reasons for it. One is, as Jim said earlier, this is at the end of the pipeline. Tennessee Gas has a spur that comes up from Massachusetts that runs within 2 miles of here. So it was a very short gas pipeline connection to provide up to 130 decatherms per day of gas to the plant. You don't find that in a whole lot of locations.
Yep.
The other thing is the electric grid, the major transmission lines running north-south, are again just a mile and a half from here.
A mile from here, yeah.
So you have the two major things that you need, plus you have the Manchester wastewater treatment plant, which could provide cooling water.
That's probably a big driver in that whole thing, is access to the water.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, in the concept of the industrial park, making this facility a contributor to their heat and electrical loads.
And had the town of Londonderry requested it? How were they involved from the beginning? Because I remember what you had told me on the phone was that the elected officials initially were very for it, and then there was a switch in the election, and then they were more against it, and that's when it went to the Supreme Court. So to what extent was there involvement of Londonderry in citing it here?
Well, one of the first things that AES would have done would have been to go to the town council and and say, we're thinking about building a major energy facility in your town. We've got an environmental partner, the Conservation Law Foundation affiliate, and we think we'd make a great fit for your eco park. That didn't work out for reasons that I'm not an expert on. But there were a lot of reasons why the town would have been interested in that, not least of which is that this plant is the largest taxpayer in the town of Londonderry.
So the industrial park was designated by the town and by region, or just by the town?
The town.
So they created an industrial park?
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, need, it does not appear to be a criteria. So whether the power is, the output is needed either for New Hampshire or for New England that's not an issue.
That's right. And the reason for that is because the generation side of the market has been deregulated in New Hampshire. So, it's up to investors to figure out whether there is going to be a market for their power or a need.
And the second question I had was just in the Vermont statute, it talks about the effect of the plant on the stability and reliability of the system. You just have the ISO do that through its Q studies and its interconnection studies, right? So the ISO just takes care of it.
So are you base load and running full capacity, or are you controlled by, does ISO dispatch you differently?
No, we're controlled by ISO New England.
Yeah. And how are they dispatching you? Are they pretty much using you all the time?
Depends on price.
Sorry?
It depends on price.
Yeah, of course.
Do you think, I just want to ask, do you think that you talked about, this project going through when it did initially versus the situation your partner just had recently? Do you think the deregulation of generation in New Hampshire is changing the process? We're changing the players of the process? We're changing the nature of the process?
Ooh, that's a really tough question, and I'd have to think out loud to answer. I don't know what you would say, Jim, but it may be to some extent, because when we had vertically integrated public utilities that were responsible for deciding when they needed to build a power plant and where they wanted to build it, they would go to the PUC. And the PUC might hold hearings, but the PUC was, by its nature, more oriented toward the question of the need for power and the rates at which it's going to be provided. Not that they weren't concerned about environmental issues, but that wasn't their primary charge. Now this siting process, which really dates back to Seabrook Station, that's when it came in, is a reflection of the fact that not only is the market deregulated, but that people are more concerned about environmental issues generally involving power plants. Seabrook was a good example. People were really worried about nuclear accidents. Here, when you're bringing in large quantities of gas, people wondered about whether it was going to be safe to store the gas, or might it explode? So there had to be testimony about how we have standards for dealing with that, and a whole raft of safety mechanisms to control for that.
When in prehistory too, NEPOOL, before the restructuring, NEPOOL would act on behalf of all of the integrated utilities in New England and would determine whether a unit was a NEPOOL unit, and and NEPOOL would decide. Collectively the pool would decide what the ownership shares were, right? And so a lot of these issues didn't arise, and then if it was a NEPOOL unit, then all of the issues of need and interconnection and all of that were covered. After the restructuring, right, then that makes a lot of sense why this commission came about, because in the ancient times, right, NEPOOL did it all.
I guess I'm going to say yes, in the ancient days, NEPOOL did it all, but I think why this Siting Commission came about, he's right. I think it's more because, it's why I think we changed a lot of our process in the early 70s, was because of Yankee, and that people actually didn't like the fact that it was too easy for utilities to site without some, comment from outside kind of thing. What I'm wondering though now, because I guess I'm just trying to get a sense to get some comparables here for myself. So when this plant went up, you said about $6 billion worth of investment was made in a number of large plants.
There were 57 proposals in New England at the time that it was the same thing as the wind stuff we're seeing now.
No.
But back then it was natural gas.
Yeah, but I want to get a sense of, so that happened then, but since then, are the plants, or the processes, or the proposals in New Hampshire smaller in size? Are we all ratcheting down for renewables as opposed to, 752 megawatt facilities? I mean, what's happening now that you're seeing?
There are traditional natural gas resources. For example, there's traditional fossil fuel projects that are being considered, and some are being cited. Those are being cited based on the signals of the forward capacity market, which will dictate whether there's value in siting a large facility. Renewables are being cited basically because of the RECs, renewable energy credits, and other out-of-market conditions that are allowing those costly units to be installed. And invariably by the technology, they're much smaller. There may be a plethora of those out there. There may be 100 or 50 or whatever the number is, and the siting demands are different than a centralized power station. So,
did you want to ask, are the units that are now coming online and being planned much smaller than the Seabrooks or the Yankees or this
no, not necessarily. I mean, there's a 500 megawatt plant in Salem, Massachusetts that's being considered.
That's also done through a repowerment process where they're going to retire an existing older facility and substitute it for something that's more flexible to a need of the grid.
Well, I actually did want to, really what I was asking was what he answered for me, the fact that, what is different today, if anything, and it's just, the credit issues,
it's the
pushing
subsidies.
things, or maybe pushing different kinds of things than you would do from either an electric need or an environmental,
Right, but again, as was pointed out, I think just generally, the process for moving to the vertically integrated utilities where you had statewide planning processes in place versus a regional plan, and transmission infrastructure build out to equalize the power flows and things like that, has created a much more efficient process. And I think that the Siting Council activities at the various states are very important because of the collation of all the different permitting activities, the one-stop shopping, if you will, and the efficiency of the process, which also allows more transparency and public intervention at some level.
What's the average docket of the site evaluation committee, like, let's say annually? I mean, how many cases come before it a year?
I'd be guessing, but it's not huge. If they do 3 cases a year, that's a lot.
That's what I thought I remember them saying. Yeah, 3 to 4 a year average.
Well, at 30 megawatts as your base, that's, other than a plant like this for renewables, that's...
I did have a question on that 30 megawatt, because you did say, and I remember Jacopino saying it as well, that you can opt in.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you may not know this, but about how many do opt in from lower than 30 megawatt, and of those that are opting in, are they more the towns deciding that they want to do it because they don't have the plans in place, or is it more the developers deciding to opt in?
It can be both.
I'd heard it was both. I just wanted to get a sense of
I'll give you an
magnitude.
example of each. The Leominster Wind Project was a case where the town of Leominster asked the SEC to take jurisdiction, even though it was only a 24-megawatt wind project, so it wouldn't have met the jurisdictional requirement for the SEC. But Leominster didn't have zoning regulations, and they were anxious. They didn't have any legal framework for dealing with the kinds of issues that the wind farm presented.
And so does a decision have to be made about whether or not the SEC will take jurisdiction?
Yes.
Okay, so that the town has to ask.
Yes.
And the SEC has to agree.
That's right.
And I'm sure the SEC agreed. In a case where a town doesn't have zoning requirements, I would think that politically it would be a nightmare not to say yes.
Right, but and then the developer doesn't. The developer can't say no. So it's basically,
That's
I'm being
right.
incredibly inarticulate, but it's the SEC's decision, and the town petitions, SEC approves.
Right.
Okay.
And
So that's a great example then.
And then there was an opposite case more recently in the town of Antrim, where it was the developer that went to the SEC and asked the SEC to take jurisdiction because the town was divided. There was a big block in town that wanted the wind farm and an equally vociferous block that didn't want it, and they were fighting with each other before the selectmen and the planning board, and they were trying to pass regulations that would prevent the wind farm from coming in. And the developer didn't want to have to deal with that morass.
I'm sure you guys wouldn't have that problem.
No.
But in that case, in a case like that, what weight would the existing zoning laws of the town have? Because, okay, why a town, if it's under 30 megawatts and it comes into a town, the town's zoning rules control. So if the town has zoning, developer says, I want to go to the SEC, do those town zoning rules still control?
I want to be careful because I don't know of a situation where that has actually occurred, but everything I know about the process tells me that if a town had local zoning regulations that were intended to address the height, for example, of wind towers, unless the SEC or some court felt that it was simply an attempt to keep wind farms out, in other words, if it was a reasonable attempt to regulate, I would guess that would be upheld. I'm basing that on what I know about the way in which the courts deal with telecommunications towers.
Can I ask, when the FCC is operating, and so the applicant applies for all their permits from all the various agencies, then is the FCC setting time limits and getting things done in a reasonable fashion?
There are time limits set in the statute.
So one reason a developer might want the FCC process is to really hold all of the agencies who are giving them permits their feet to the fire.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise things could languish someplace.
Absolutely.
Why are you pointing at me?
No, but
You are pointing at me.
And to that end, if I may, in Connecticut, I developed and constructed a project in which had difficulties meeting certain timelines, first fire of the machines and things like that based on technical issues. We had to submit a report every month to the siting council as to the progress. They also had an engineer that came out periodically and evaluated the project's progress. And because of the delay, we actually had to seek relief from the timeline and get specific approval to extend as the developer.
Is there automatic either approval or denial of timelines?
It wasn't automatic. We had to submit our reasons why and seek the grace of the council.
But if time runs out, is the answer no? Or is there a default if time runs out?
You would never let the time run out before you had that under control.
Right.
I think
otherwise the project stops.
Part of the question is actually the reverse, though, is that are there mirror timelines for the agencies involved?
Yes.
So in New Hampshire's case,
the SEC sets out a schedule by which it wants each of the agencies to come in with their preliminary findings, and they do that at say month 4. Okay, and then They send them back, and by month 8, they're supposed to be back with their final findings.
A question, and one that we're struggling with in Vermont, is that there are some permits which, by virtue of seasonal or other limitations, can take longer than what I think you have a 9-month total, or right? Than what the 9-month total may be, which could potentially delay things or make things not come in simultaneously. How do you deal with that?
There are provisions in the statute for deadlines to be extended by the committee at its discretion for good cause. And it's happened occasionally. It happened a couple of times in this last go-around on the Antrim Wind project.
But if you were an applicant, and it's not like New Hampshire's got different issues than Vermont has, you'd also might time your application, you might time the process to be sure you hit all the right
Except
timing.
if it's one-stop shop, and that's where I'm not quite sure. Is there like a case manager that sits down with the applicant at the beginning and says, look, these are the 15 permits that you need to get. This is the timeline for each permit. This is what you need to anticipate. You better get started quickly on this one because stormwater is going to take you 10 times longer than wetlands or whatever.
The applicant is really responsible for figuring all that out. And if the applicant is experienced, he will have already started that process of making the individual applications for a dredge and fill permit in wetlands and for a noise permit or whatever, well before the big application goes into the SEC.
I'm sorry. I'm just really anxious of time because I know we say if it's 2 hours, we cannot be late for a public hearing.
It'll take.
Has the SEC ever denied a permit? I seem to recall that was answered.
Yeah, it has. It has. I think that's what he answered when he said.
Another reason for applicants wanting to go to the SEC is that they're more likely to get an approval?
There are people who will tell you that the SEC is more likely to